A year ago, if you asked almost anyone in the AI industry what powered advanced artificial intelligence, the answer would have been immediate. Nvidia. Whether it was training massive language models, running data centers, or building the next generation of AI systems, Nvidia's GPUs sat at the center of everything. They weren't just the leading option. In many cases, they were the only option. Entire companies were designed around accessing more Nvidia hardware. Governments worried about who could buy it. Investors treated it like digital gold. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of trying to build a better Nvidia GPU, China started asking a completely different question. What if the future of AI wasn't about having the best GPU at all? What if the real advantage came from redesigning the entire system around a different idea, a different architecture, a different software stack, a different way of moving data? Today, that question has turned into something very real because a new generation of Chinese AI infrastructure is beginning to deliver results without relying on Nvidia's ecosystem in the way the industry assumed was necessary. And whether you're impressed, skeptical, or somewhere in between, one thing is becoming difficult to ignore. The conversation is no longer about catching Nvidia. It's about whether the rules that made Nvidia dominant are starting to change. Let's get into it. For most of the last decade, the global AI industry operated under a remarkably simple assumption. If you wanted to build powerful artificial intelligence, you needed Nvidia. Not because Nvidia had better marketing, not because it had the best stock performance, but because Nvidia had quietly become the foundation underneath modern AI itself. The company's GPUs weren't just chips anymore. They had evolved into an entire ecosystem. Hardware, software, networking, developer tools, optimization frameworks, training libraries, and years of accumulated engineering expertise all worked together to create a moat so wide that many experts believed it might never be crossed. To understand why the latest developments out of China are attracting so much attention, you first need to understand how Nvidia built that position in the first place. Most people think Nvidia won because it built faster processors. That's only partially true. The real genius was that Nvidia realized early that AI wasn't simply a hardware problem. It was a software problem, a systems problem, a developer problem. Long before generative AI became a household term, Nvidia invested heavily in CUDA, a software platform that allowed researchers and engineers to write applications specifically optimized for Nvidia hardware. Year after year, developers built tools around CUDA. Universities taught CUDA. Research papers depended on CUDA. Startups launched products on CUDA. By the time ChatGPT exploded into public consciousness, Nvidia wasn't just selling chips. It was selling the language that modern AI spoke. And that created an extraordinary advantage. If you were training a cutting-edge AI model using Nvidia hardware, often felt less like a choice and more like a requirement. The best frameworks worked there. The largest communities existed there. The fastest support networks existed there. Every improvement reinforced every other improvement. The ecosystem became stronger simply because more people were using. That's one of the most powerful dynamics in technology. Once enough people gather around a platform, leaving becomes incredibly difficult. Then came the restrictions. Over the past several years, access to advanced AI hardware became increasingly entangled with geopolitics. Export controls tightened. Access to the newest GPUs became more complicated. Companies that once assumed they could simply purchase more Nvidia hardware suddenly faced uncertainty, and uncertainty creates a powerful incentive. It forces people to explore alternatives they might otherwise ignore. And what's fascinating is that China didn't initially respond by trying to build a perfect Nvidia clone. That would have been the obvious approach. It also would have been the hardest. Competing directly against a company that spent nearly 2 decades building a software ecosystem is incredibly difficult. Even if you somehow match the hardware, you still need developers, you still need tools, you still need optimization, you still need trust. Instead, Chinese companies began exploring a different path. Rather than asking how to replicate Nvidia exactly, they started asking how much of Nvidia's advantage actually came from the GPU itself. That sounds like a subtle distinction, but it's hugely important. If the answer was almost all of it, then competing would be nearly impossible. But if part of Nvidia's dominance came from assumptions built into the industry's workflow, and then perhaps those assumptions could be challenged, think about it like this. Imagine an entire transportation industry built around one type of engine. For years, everyone assumes the engine is the reason the vehicles are successful. But eventually someone realizes that much of the performance comes from the roads, the logistics systems, the maintenance infrastructure, and the way the vehicles are organized. And suddenly, the problem isn't building a better engine. The problem is redesigning the entire transportation system, and that's increasingly how some Chinese AI developers began approaching the challenge. The focus shifted toward system-level optimization, specialized accelerators, custom AI chips, new software frameworks, alternative computing architectures, distributed processing models. Instead of relying on a single dominant component, the goal became making the entire stack work together efficiently. And here's where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because many people outside the industry assume AI performance is determined entirely by raw computing power. In reality, moving data is often just as important as processing it. Training modern AI models involves staggering amounts of information flowing between processors, memory systems, storage devices, and networking equipment. Bottlenecks appear everywhere. Sometimes adding more compute doesn't solve the problem, and sometimes it makes the problem worse. Engineers have known this for years, and the fastest system isn't always the one with the fastest processor. The fastest system is often the one that moves information most efficiently. This realization opened the door for a different kind of competition. Instead of competing chip versus chip, companies could compete architecture versus architecture, and that is exactly where some of China's newest AI efforts began focusing their energy. One thing I find fascinating about technology races is that they often look completely different from the outside than they do from the inside. Headlines tend to focus on dramatic breakthroughs, bigger numbers, faster chips, new products, but engineers frequently obsess over entirely different things: latency, bandwidth, efficiency, power consumption, reliability. The details rarely make headlines, yet those details often determine who wins. And if you've made it this far into the video, I'd actually love to hear something from you. When stories like this appear in the news, do you see them primarily as technology stories or as geopolitical stories? Because the more I research this industry, the harder it becomes to separate the two. Let me know what you think. I genuinely read through those perspectives because they're often more thoughtful than people expect. Now, another reason this shift matters is timing. The AI boom has created demand levels that would have seemed absurd just a few years ago. Data centers are expanding at extraordinary speed. Companies are spending billions on AI infrastructure. Governments are treating advanced computing capacity as a strategic resource. In an environment like that, relying on a single supplier becomes risky, regardless of how good that supplier is. That's not a criticism of Nvidia, it's simply a reality of scale. Whenever demand grows faster than supply, alternatives become attractive. Whenever access becomes uncertain, alternatives become attractive. Whenever costs rise, alternatives become attractive. And whenever a market becomes large enough, someone inevitably starts searching for a different way to solve the problem. And that's the environment that gave rise to China's latest AI initiatives. Not an attempt to build an identical version of Nvidia's ecosystem, an attempt to build something that works differently, something that bypasses certain dependencies altogether. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds remains one of the most important questions in the technology industry right now. Because if powerful AI systems can be built and deployed without relying on the traditional Nvidia-centered model, the implications extend far beyond one company. They could reshape investment decisions, supply chains, research priorities, and even the future direction of AI development itself. And the most surprising part is that the technology making this possible isn't necessarily a breakthrough in raw computing power. It's a breakthrough in how the entire system is organized. And that's where the story gets really interesting. The reason this story is attracting so much attention isn't because China has suddenly built a single miracle chip that outperforms everything Nvidia has ever created. That's not what's happening. The real story is far more important. What's emerging is an entirely different philosophy for building AI infrastructure, one that focuses less on having the world's most powerful individual processor and more on creating a system where every component is optimized to work together. And if that sounds familiar, it's because some of the biggest shifts in computing history followed exactly that pattern. For decades, technology leadership often came from building the fastest component, the fastest CPU, the fastest storage, and the fastest graphics processor. But modern AI has changed the economics of performance. Today's frontier models aren't limited by one piece of hardware. They're limited by the interaction between thousands or even tens of thousands of components operating simultaneously. The challenge is no longer simply computation. The challenge is coordination. Imagine trying to run a massive orchestra with 10,000 musicians. Giving every musician a better instrument helps, but eventually the bigger challenge becomes keeping everyone synchronized. The conductor matters. The sheet music matters. The communication system matters. The organization matters. If those pieces fail, the quality of the individual instruments becomes less important. That's increasingly true in AI. The most advanced AI systems now operate across enormous clusters of hardware. Information is constantly moving between processors. Data must be stored, retrieved, distributed, and synchronized. Every inefficiency creates delays. Every delay multiplies across the system. Engineers often describe this as a scaling problem. As AI systems grow larger, the difficulty of coordinating everything grows even faster. This is where many of China's latest AI projects are focusing their effort. Instead of trying to win every benchmark on raw chip performance, they're investing heavily in reducing system bottlenecks, faster interconnects, better workload distribution, more efficient memory architectures. Optimized software frameworks, AI-specific accelerators designed around particular tasks rather than universal computing. And the result is something surprising. In certain workloads, systems built around less powerful hardware can sometimes achieve results that appear disproportionately strong compared to their individual components. Not because the hardware magically became faster, but because the system wastes less time waiting for itself. And that's a subtle distinction, but it's incredibly important. Throughout technology history, some of the biggest breakthroughs came from improving efficiency rather than brute force performance. Sometimes the winner isn't the machine with the biggest engine. It's the machine that uses its engine most effectively. And that's exactly why Nvidia's position, while still extraordinarily strong, is facing a different kind of challenge than many people expected. For years, most analysts assumed competitors would attack Nvidia directly, build faster GPUs, build cheaper GPUs, build GPUs with more memory. Instead, some competitors are increasingly trying to reduce the importance of the GPU itself. That's a very different strategy. If successful, it changes the competitive landscape entirely. Now, before anyone rushes to the comments saying Nvidia is finished, let's be realistic. Nvidia remains one of the most powerful technology companies in the world. Its ecosystem is enormous, its engineering talent is extraordinary, its software advantage remains significant. Millions of developers continue building on its platforms. Some of the most advanced AI systems ever created still rely heavily on Nvidia hardware. That reality hasn't changed, but what has changed is the assumption that there is only one path forward. And once alternatives begin demonstrating real-world results, even if those alternatives aren't perfect, the market starts paying attention. Because technology industries rarely stay static. What looks unbreakable often turns out to be vulnerable in unexpected ways. The biggest weakness of dominant platforms is rarely technological inferiority. It's usually dependency. The larger a platform becomes, the more assumptions get built around it. Those assumptions create strength, but they can also create rigidity. Competitors often succeed not by beating the leader at its own game, but by changing the game entirely. That's why this story matters. Not because Nvidia suddenly stopped being important, not because one announcement changed the balance of power overnight, but because the conversation itself is changing. A few years ago, asking whether advanced AI could be built without heavy dependence on Nvidia would have sounded almost absurd. Today, serious engineers, investors, policymakers, and researchers are actively exploring that possibility. And once a possibility becomes credible, enormous resources start flowing toward it. One thing I always find fascinating is how quickly narratives can flip in technology. A company can spend years building what appears to be an insurmountable lead, only to discover that the next phase of innovation rewards a completely different set of strengths. History is filled with examples. Mainframes gave way to personal computers. Desktop computing gave way to mobile devices. Traditional software gave way to cloud platforms. Every transition looked impossible until it was already happening. That doesn't mean the current transition will play out the same way, but it does remind us that dominance and permanence are not the same thing. If you've enjoyed this deep dive so far, and if you're someone who likes looking beneath headlines rather than just reading them, consider subscribing. Not because subscriptions are numbers on a dashboard, but because these conversations are more interesting when they're shared with people who are genuinely curious about where technology is going. Some of the smartest observations I come across are buried in comments from viewers who see angles I completely missed. And speaking of comments, I want your honest perspective on something. If a company builds the most advanced ecosystem, but another group finds a way around it, who actually wins? The original innovator who created the standard, or the competitor who proves the standard isn't the only path? There isn't an easy answer, but it's exactly the kind of question that shapes entire industries. Here's what I think is the biggest takeaway. The future of AI may be less about individual chips and more about complete systems, less about isolated components and more about integration, less about raw power and more about efficiency, coordination, and architecture. And if that's true, then the companies and countries that succeed won't necessarily be the ones with the single fastest processor. And they'll be the ones that build the smartest overall platform. And that's why China's latest AI efforts deserve attention. Not because they've already won, not because Nvidia has already lost, but because they've demonstrated something many people thought wasn't possible. They've shown that there may be another route forward. Whether that route eventually becomes a highway or remains a side road is still unknown. But the fact that it exists at all changes the conversation. And sometimes changing the conversation is the first sign that an industry is about to change as well. The next few years are going to be fascinating to watch because what we're witnessing isn't simply a competition between companies. It's a competition between ideas, a competition between architectures, a competition between different visions of how artificial intelligence should be built. And for the first time in a long time, the outcome feels a lot less certain than many people assumed. If you stayed until the end, thank you. Seriously. These topics can get technical, but they're also some of the most important stories shaping the future of technology. I'd love to know what you think. Do you believe Nvidia's ecosystem remains too strong to challenge, or do you think we're entering an era where alternative AI platforms finally become viable competitors? Drop your honest thoughts below. I read far more of them than you probably realize. And until next time,